Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding. We, thy unworthy servants, here gathered together, in thy name do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsel may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of the island, and the united and knitting together of all hearts of all persons and estate within the same, in true Christian love and charity one to another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
This honourable House now resume its sittings. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Mr. Nigel Clarke, Dr. Nigel Clarke, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahoo Ford, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terrelong, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brownberg, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clarke, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Goulding, Dr. Guy, Miss Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Mr. Henry, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nito, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mrs. Vaz, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright.
After the speaker talk, you will talk.
Members, the Armistice Day signaling the end of World War I was signed on the 11th of November 1918 at 11 a.m. It is therefore means that Sunday, November the 10th, 2019 marks 101 years since the armistice was signed. The first actual Poppy Day was held in Britain on November the 11th, 1921. Today, we are lending our support to the Jamaica Legion to show that we care and recognize the sacrifice they made that resulted in our freedom we enjoy today. The Jamaica Legion representative is ex-Sergeant Mr. Peter Williams of the Jamaica Defense Force. He's here. I'm going to request that he take us through the drill. Mr. Williams. Before you go, Leader of Government Business, Mr. Samuel.
I beg to move that the meeting of the House be suspended briefly to enable the members to pay tribute to fallen soldiers and veterans of World War II.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? As I will. Mr. Williams, you may.
Go now. May we ever pray, Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. As the going down of the sun, and in the morning we will remember them.
Statements by Minister. Sorry, you go ahead. This Honourable House now resume its sittings. Statement by Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as was the case last week, the last time we met, I made a request of you, and you so kindly accommodated that, because it is customary for members who will speak, invite members of their constituencies to share with us their presence, and we don't wish to engage them in all the various other aspects of the day's work. I ask, Mr. Speaker, that you suspend standing orders to enable us to proceed to public business. To public business, in order to enable the member from West Rural St. Andrew to make her contribution to the constituency debate.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? For your presentation, we wish to recognize a number of students from UTEC School of Business Administration. Please welcome them along with their teacher. We wish that you have a pleasant time with us today. And we will start now, the member from West Rural, St. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me say how grateful I am to stand and represent the people of West Rural St. Andrew. I want to thank our Prime Minister for his continued support as a people's representative. Let me also thank my constituents who are here today. Some of them are here today. My constituency secretary, my CDF assistant, my councillors and my management team who helped me to victory 3 years ago. My husband, Lavon, my everlasting rock. Thanks for everything. West Rural, like all urban rural constituencies, faces many challenges. Lack of water and proper road infrastructure has been an issue for many residents. Like any house, Mr. Speaker, that is built, proper maintenance is needed. However, if none of this is done in a period of, say, 18 to 22 years, then what happens is the house will deteriorate. Thank heavens, as we have a visionary leader in our Prime Minister who understands this, and I'm happy West Rural is finally being fixed little by little. Over $300 million have been spent so far fixing major infrastructure like bridges, retaining walls, and roadways. Even with this intervention, many interior roadways are in very bad conditions, but I'm confident that with my representation and this government, they will be addressed. Mr. Speaker, water has been a major contention in many parts of West Rural, but as I said, it takes time to do what should have been done years ago, and our government is addressing the water crisis in rural Jamaica, as we have seen an increase of $695 million in the budget for rural water. The people living in Pinto area of approximately 2,000 residents will be able to finally say they can shower and not have to travel a mile down the road to a standpipe to catch water. Because guess what? $11 million was spent on this upgrade of the community tank, which was sitting there rusting and going nowhere. Shamefully, since our independence, the people living in Fraser Road across the street have never had pipes to their community, but now that is a story of the past. This tank will also serve those people. This is moving towards prosperity. Mr. Speaker, Speaker, the Rock Hall Primary School now has a 30,000-gallon tank for rainwater catchment. That is forward thinking. And a 10,000-gallon tank with NWC potable water. Thanks to Senator Honorable Pernell Charles, that was commissioned a few weeks ago and is serving the school. Lawrence Tavern, King Weston, Red Hills Primary School were also upgraded with tanks for rainwater catchment. Essex Hall Primary School was also upgraded with a tank to feed not only the school, but work will be done laying pipes to feed the community. West Rural is being transformed to a new Jamaica. But Mr. Speaker, the water crisis in Unity, Border, and Mahoney has not gone unnoticed. The minister has assured myself and my councillor, John Myers, that this is top priority and will be addressed. Pipes will be laid from Mahoney to Lawrence Tavern very soon. That will also address the water shortage that they're now facing. To our citizens, I am now asking that as the systems are upgraded, do your part and not attach pipes illegally, but become real customers, because that's how you empower yourselves and future generations. Mr. Speaker, crime is of some concern, especially domestic violence. And I say to our men, stop abusing our women, mothers and fathers. Stop abusing our boys and girls verbally, sexually, and psychologically. I am therefore very grateful, Minister Delroy Chuck, who I called upon, and in a matter of 2 weeks he came to visit the constituency to look at the police station and the justice center that was there. Mr. Chuck, a justice center is coming soon in 2020 to Stony Hill. I have to say, the land has been cleared. The land has been cleared, and looking forward to such a center, because the PMI groups in that community will be able to address violence prevention at the community level and to teach our children and parents conflict resolution before an escalation into serious crimes. I want to also thank the Dr. Oris Chang. We will also have, a new police station in Stony Hill. Mr. Speaker, once renovated, we will need more police vehicles and police for effective policing. Mr. Speaker, I want to see the Jamaica Eye in our major squares, especially in Lawrence Tavern, Red Hill Square, Golden Spring, and Stony Hill. And I would like to see these connected with CCTV to each police station from the square. Stony Hill Square is a major priority for transformation to have law and order. The congestion created daily is hazardous to mental health. Mr. Speaker, the disorder is unbelievable and must be addressed. The universal law says when laws are transgressed, you can be assured of suffering. And Stony Hill Square right now is suffering. We need a bus lay-by with proper sidewalk and relocation of the crosswalk away from the four-way stop sign. Mr. Speaker, focus must now be on rural Jamaica, building rural Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, proper health care should be everybody's business. And so I am very happy that Dr. Tufton has taken the bull by the horn and dealing with the issues after years of little maintenance, repairs, or upgrading our hospitals and health centers. Stony Hill, Mr. Speaker, finally have an upgraded, state-of-the-art, $79 million refurbished health center with comfortable waiting area, fully AC'd, with seating capacity indoors for over 200 patients. Mr. Speaker, no longer will patients endure sitting under a dilapidated tent facing the elements of rain and heat. The people now have a first-class health center. Thanks to Minister Dr. Tufton and the National Health Fund for listening to my call. The people of Stony Hill and the surrounding areas are grateful. We must now take a look at upgrading the Lawrence Tavern Health Center and continue the upgrade of the Red Hill Center in the next budget, Mr. Speaker. I want to also point out that the Patmore Clinic was upgraded a few years ago. However, it's only open once per month for pregnant mothers. Mr. Speaker, the population in Patmore is an aging one, and I believe it would serve better for persons with hypertension and other NCDs. It should open its door at least once per week for our most vulnerable who find it difficult to make the trip to Red Hills. Thanks to this government's Hope Unattached program and my CDF, I was able to establish a skills training center in Red Hills and will see over 150 students graduate with Hard Trust NTA certification in web page design, electrical, housekeeping, and BPO from last year's program. A number of them are now employed, especially in the BPO sector. This year, Mr. Speaker, we will add 2 more skills to that program. General beauty therapy, which includes massage, makeup, manicure, and barbering for the men. Our youths in the Red Hills and Rock Hall area are very excited about this successful program and its impact, because not everyone will go to university. So this major opportunity for youngsters to gain employment from a skill of their choice is a good thing. Coming soon in February, the Stony Hill Pavilion in the Rocky Valley community will have a newly refurbished $4 million study and homework center. Thanks to Minister Ed Bartlett through the TF, we will leave no child behind. The netball court at this said pavilion also has lights for night matches through my CDF from the constituency. Sports and education going hand in hand. Mr. Speaker, the Mount James community in Brandon Hill now has a homework center. Thanks to the Chase Foundation for their partnership and donation of $1.5 million, furnished with 8 computers, desk, AC printer. The children no longer have to drive miles away to Stony Hill to do their assignments. Let me also thank Logic One, who's providing free internet service for this center. Mr. Speaker, this once closed, abandoned school is now put to good use. I plan to have Jamaica Lifelong Learning at this center in 2020 because the community is now making that request. The social needs of our children must be a focus, making sure all our children are in schools and their social needs met. Mr. Speaker, I would like to see a social worker assigned to each primary school, or at least 1 to every 3 schools, so we can get a handle on our children's social welfare needs. They should work closely with a guidance counselor to make better assessment of students' needs. If we want to achieve 2030 agenda, it must be prioritized to have a more equitable society. Parents must also be held accountable when their children are not in school. Mr. Speaker, As we move towards SDGs 2030 for equity and prosperity, basic needs must be met. And I know that with this government, we will. Home ownership is of utmost importance and is a move being made through the HAJ to regularize over 300 persons in the Temple Hall area. HAJ, I now say make this happen soon, because these people have been waiting since Operation Pride. Some unfortunately have passed on, so this is urgent that these citizens get their titles in order to be approved for legal electricity and water. I am also asking the current residents to stop making adjustments to the homes so they can be granted their titles. Mr. Speaker, to gain generational wealth, owning your own property can be a great start. So informal settlements must be addressed, and this government is serious about solutions. The lack of proper sanitation, access to potable water and open sewers must be addressed in the many communities. We should be ashamed as parliamentarians to drive to these, in our pretty vehicles to these places asking for votes. But Mr. Speaker, Bowden Hill is not one of those communities. Mr. Speaker, Bowden Hill, a community of over 2,000 residents, has never had potable water, but in 2 weeks they will be saying differently.
Yes, yes, yes.
That same community, Mr. Speaker, their roadway to the community is also being rehabilitated for $35 million. The Bowden Hill Primary School also has been outfitted with 10 computers and solar panels thanks to the USF, and this will be commissioned soon. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking that JPS provide electricity to
Minister, the time for presentation of the member has expired. You may wish to seek an extension by resolution.
Mr. Speaker, I ask the members that the members' time be extended for 5 minutes to enable her to complete her presentation.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? As I will.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking that JPS provide electricity to informal communities, allowing persons with pay-as-you-go metering system, and NWC to provide water to all communities with similar pay-as-you-go system. Titles on government land should be granted for after a period of time, but local authorities must make sure rules are adhered in these communities to prevent overcrowding and more informal settlement. Mr. Speaker, this year there was a gruesome death of a little girl raped and murdered in West Rural St. Andrew. She lived in such a community without electricity, potable water, or proper sanitation. Mr. Speaker, we must, as government, fix this, and I know we will. We cannot stand by and continue to watch this happen. Basic service should be provided to the citizens. And the citizens, you must uphold the law when granted these services and pay. Garbage collection and waste disposal is an issue being worked on. I'm hoping that with the 100 trucks coming soon, West Rural St. Andrew can have dedicated trucks for our problem areas on a regular basis. I have all the confidence in this administration with our Prime Minister Andrew Holness at the helm. I know, little by little, brick by brick, we will build a new Jamaica that is firm and strong. My councillors and I will continue to work on behalf of the people, because there is much more work to do in Red Hills, Lawrence Tavern, Brandon Hill, and Stony Hill. And, Mr. Speaker, with good health and strength, I will continue to serve the people of West Rural, my constituents, from poverty to prosperity. I thank you.
Well done. absolutely stunning. You should have licked them with a number 13.
Mr. Speaker, I now move that the order of business consistent with the agenda
Yeah, man.
on the order
A
paper
gold medal for
commence in the normal manner.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Shimido. Announcements. Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions. Papers. Reports from committees. Notices of motions given orally. Questions and answers to questions. Motion that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice.
I believe in microphones down at this end of the chamber.
Which item are you speaking on?
Guess why?
Order, please.
Bright fella. Mr. Speaker, I'm inquiring when the many questions that are overdue listed in my name will be answered.
Mr. Shimido, can
Mr.
you
Speaker.
assist?
Mr. Speaker, the member, of course, refers to the questions asked of the Minister of Finance. There are two questions asked of the Minister of Finance. One refers to the Minister of Transport and Mining. Two, in fact, are related to the Minister of Transport, Mr. Speaker. And so, and in addition, as I look down, I see that there are two additional ones for the Minister of Transport. Minister of Transport has a little work to do. That makes a total of 4. And then I just see here that the Minister of Finance has an additional one. So, Mr. Speaker, to add to that, the Minister of Agriculture, and my goodness, I see another question, yet another question to the Minister of Transport and Mining. So we also have a question asked of the Minister of Science, Energy and Technology. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the members responsible for answering these questions ensure that next week they come equipped to respond. So, member, I will use my best efforts to see to it that these answers are provided.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the leader of government business is not concerned. His suggestion to the members now as his best efforts. But certainly after the sitting that he'll ensure that the answers will be given at the appropriate time, because some of the questions are long outstanding. 4th day of June is the earliest one on the agenda here. Sorry, well that's me, but Reverend 3, it's on the 11th day of June coming down. So we are going to hold you to that commitment, House Leader, and next week we will have the raft of all those questions answered.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the House.
Mr. Speaker, in relation to motions relative to the sitting of the House, it is clear that on the existing schedule of meetings and the time that is available for us at these meetings on a Tuesday beginning at 2, that the business of the House, which is already on the order paper, let alone the interposition of the constituency debates will mean that we are unable to finish what we must or what we ought within the prescribed time. I would like to support an initiative that we extend the sittings on a Tuesday for additional hours before 2 o'clock in order that we may complete the business and stop embarrassing ourselves by falling short of the prerogative of members and the needs of the people of Jamaica. I believe that the leader of the House may have something to say on this matter, and I anticipating his sentiments, I would like to offer full support.
The leader of the House indicated last week that he would propose such changes. I'm going to ask that the leader of government business and the leader of opposition business meet and advise us next week. Well, okay, no problem. You will advise us when? Next week, right? Okay. Motions relating to the sitting of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Minimum Business Tax Repeal Act 2019.
Wait,
Minister.
Minister. A bill shortly entitled the Minimum Business Tax Repeal Act 2019 read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Public business.
Mr. Speaker, today we have a debate to be continued on the Act to amend the Human Employment and Resource Training Act to merge the functions of the Human Employment and Resource Training Trust with the National Youth Service Board and the Apprenticeship Board to repeal the Apprenticeship Act and the National Youth Service Act and for connected matters. Now, I understand that the opposition spokesman would prefer to make his contribution when the minister with responsibility for the bill is present. He's somewhat, he's off the island and is not able to be here today, so I will ensure that it be taken as soon as he returns. No, it's not. It wasn't brought by me. It wasn't brought. It wasn't brought by me. Heart is not in education, you know. All right. So, Mr. Speaker, we will now take the Proceeds of Crime Act 2019 regulations. And the Minister of National Security is here, bushy-tailed and ready to go.
All right, House Leader.
Dr. Chang.
Thank you, sir. Brothers Road Chieftain. Mr. Speaker, Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Prevention Amendment Regulation 2019. Mr. Speaker, the Procedure of Crime Money Laundering Prevention Regulations 207 details the regime applicable to business in the regulated sector for purposes of preventing and detecting money laundering. Pursuant to Section 102 and 138 of the Procedure of Crime Act 207, the Minister, subject to affirmative resolution, may make regulations generally for giving effect to the provisions and purposes of the Act. In this regard, the Procedure of Crime, Money Laundering Prevention, and Amendment Regulation 2019 have been developed. All this got vibration here. Yeah, very quick, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, this Honorable House is asked to recall that I tabled the Procedure of Crime Amendment Act 2019 on October 15, 2019, as well as the Terrorism Protection Amendment and United Nations Security Resolution Implementation Amendment Act 2019 on October 29, 2019. At the time I mentioned, I would also be tabling regulations for Procedure of Crime Money Laundering Prevention Act. It will be further recalled that based on the review done on Jamaica's level of compliance with the Financial Action Task Force 40 recommendation and the level of effectiveness of these systems, the mutual evaluation report provided suggestions on how the system could be strengthened. Included in this report were ways to effectively amend the Procedure of Crime Money Laundering Protection Regulation 207 to make it fully compliant with the FATF, as well as being effective in Jamaica's efforts to stem money laundering. Mr. Speaker, as I noted, the evaluation report indicated that of the 40 recommendations, Jamaica is partially compliant with 21 and non-compliant with 2. As a country, we must address these technical compliance deficiencies with urgency or risk Financial Action Task Force making a public statement regarding the jurisdiction's anti-money laundering deficiencies. Consequently, the following are being introduced as amendments to the regulations. The amendments, Mr. Speaker, Amendment of Regulation 2 of the Principal Regulations. Regulation 2 of the Principal Regulation is a definition section, and this is amended by inserting new definitions for control, group, and ultimate beneficial owner. The inclusion of the term ultimate beneficial owner addresses a technical gap in the legislation, whereby there is no need to establish risk profiles for ultimate financial owners. With this amendment, regulated business will be required to establish risk profiles regarding their business relationship in order to determine which of such relationships are high risk. Such determination will not only be limited to the applicant for business, but also the ultimate beneficial owner. For the terms group and control, the inclusion of these terms provide clarity with respect to the provisions included within these regulations, specifically with respect to the sharing of information within a group and the application of a group-wide policy for the implementation of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing mechanisms. Amendment to Regulation Shree. This regulation has been amended to specify the time period 15 days after the end of each month required for financial institutions to report to the designated authority on transactions involving prescribed amount. The inclusion of this provision enhances the investigative capability of the designated authority. Amendment 5. This regulation has been amended to include reference to the size and nature of the business in relation to the assessment of the risk. This amendment ensures that the regulated business is applying to the compliance requirement using a risk-based approach. This means that supervisors, financial institutions, and intermediaries identify, assess, and understand the money laundering, terrorism financing risks to which they are exposed so that they can focus their resources where the risks are highest. The fine of $400,000 with the offences to the regulation has also been increased to make it more dissuasive. For an individual, Mr. Speaker, the fine is now $3 million, and for the body corporate, it is now $5 million before the parish code. These fines are, of course, in keeping with the fines that are applicable at the parish court level. Amendment to Regulation 7. This regulation, which deals with identification procedures, business relationships, and transactions, has been amended to take into account the application of risk management procedures while a regulated business seeks to identify and verify the applicant for business. The amendment also provides for the issuance of guidelines by the competent authority, which may include limitations on the number or types of transactions that may be performed. It may also include requirements for monitoring large or complex transactions that are outside of the norm. Additionally, the amendment to Regulation 7 considers a situation where, if there is reasonable grounds to believe that a business relationship is related to money laundering, and that carrying out due diligence procedures might alert the person, then that regulated business shall, instead of performing the due diligence procedures, make the required report under Section 94 or 95 of the Act. Amendment 7A, and take note of this, I think, is where we begin the process of, in using risk-based assessment, we open up the banking sector to a wider cross-section of business activity. This is crucial in going forward in the economy. Regulation 7A requires businesses in the regulated sector to establish risk profiles for business relationship and one-off transaction to determine the type of due diligence procedures to apply. So where there is a reasonable suspicion, they will go into the full detail of due diligence. Where they have a client that is known, they are not necessarily required to do so. Under current law, they have to do the full due diligence on every single applicant for business, for accounts. The proposed amendment seeks to strengthen the risk management process by requiring business in the regulated sector to consider, among other things, the business products offered, its distribution channels, the national, regional, and international environment in which the regulated business operates, and the size and nature of its operation. Additionally, the regulation as amended stipulates that businesses in the regulated sector, in considering the risk as assessed, should employ commensurate measures in order to effectively mitigate against those risks. The amendments to Regulation 7A also allows a business in the regulated sector to apply simplified due diligence procedure to low-risk transactions once a proper evaluation of the risk has been conducted. This will allow entities subject to POCA regime to only require, for example, a government-issued identification and collecting basic information from the applicant for business. This will probably improve the ease of doing business. Of course, not necessarily for those of us who are in the House who are no concept for PEP, designated by the Minister, PEP, politically exposed personalities. That's the regulator. He has taken that order. He's the new, we'll designate him for PEP. As there's some new regulation 7B, we take note, this is part of really continuing the process of allowing risk-based analysis to open up the system to our informal sector. And we should bear in mind as we look at these two sectors which we have currently operate, which will currently own up the financial sector. Some economists suggest that up to 40% of the economy, and I guess anywhere from 35 to 40%, a huge sector of the economy will be informal. And many of those small to medium-sized businesses have a challenge opening accounts and go through a tedious process. What these new regulations are allowing us to do is to ensure that the banks themselves, based on the guidelines provided, can make a risk assessment, and the majority of them, of course, will be able to get their accounts opened with less demanding procedures, while the bank will focus their attention on where they see a level of risk that requires a greater due diligence. And in the process, of course, protect the financial institution and the country's economy, because to open up the financial sector to a small and medium-sized business is critical in ensuring growth in the economy. As it now exists, the current framework does not provide for the application of countermeasures proportionate to the risk. Recommendation of 19 of the Financial Administration Task Force requires the application of enhanced due diligence measures and other countermeasures for transactions and business relationships from countries identified by FATF as having weak anti-money laundering or counter financing terrorism systems. In order to protect the integrity of our financial systems, the new regulation regarding enhanced countermeasures has been included as 7B. This regulation sets out what needs to be undertaken when dealing with entities from specified territories so designated by the supervisory authority. These measures include imposing such limits on these business relations or transactions, providing reports or more frequent intervals, and carrying out additional audit requirements on such business activity. Amendment of Regulation 8. This regulation has been amended to provide a greater level of transparency in the process of granting exemption in relation to de minimis amounts that may not be subject to customer identification and verification procedures. The amendment allows the minister to specify the amount and prescribe any category of regulated business on the recommendation of the competent authority and the designated authority. Amendment of Regulation 19. Regulation 9 has been amended to require that business conducting electronic funds transfer shall ensure that it A. receives and includes in its records accurate information throughout the payment cycle, B. identify and verify the recipient of funds transferred exceeding US $500, and C. has in place risk-based policies and procedures. The change to this regulation was made in a bid to strengthen the current regime surrounding wire transfers. In this regard, businesses in the regulated sector would now be required to apply risk-based policies and procedures for determining whether to execute, reject, or suspend a wire transfer lacking the required information relating to the persons involved, and to establish the appropriate follow-up action. Amendment 11, of course, this Amendment 9 is of specific interest to Jamaica, given the containing a lot of scamming or advanced credit fraud that occurs out here. All these regulations are designed to strengthen our entire financial system. Although we are really being reactive to ensuring that we meet our international obligations, these regulations are crucial in strengthening the entire suite of legislation in protecting the financial system of the country. Amendment of Regulation 11. The amendment to this regulation mandates the identification and verification of the identification of the person purporting agent to act on behalf of a customer. This amendment will improve the process of identifying the beneficial owner of the property or funds subject to the financial business concern, as well as identifying and verifying the agent acting on their behalf. This also addresses a technical requirement by FATF. Amendment 12. Time period of 15 days has been included in this amendment to provide more definite timelines for the provision of identification information in respect of third parties. The amendment of this regulation provides a greater efficiency and improves the process relating to identification and verification procedures. Amendment of Regulation 13. This regulation has been amended to strengthen the process for the conduct of due diligence on the beneficiary of life insurance or other insurance contract. As such, the regulation now calls for the regulated business to undertake the identification and verification of the beneficiary of a life insurance. This is to be done at the time of payout and making it a requirement to obtain sufficient information to enable it to identify and verify the identity of the beneficiary. Mandating the identification and verification of the beneficiary of a life insurance policy at the time of payout will facilitate the risk management process, specifically for the purposes of assessing whether the beneficiary falls within the high-risk categorization, thereby requiring the use of enhanced due diligence procedures. Amendment of Regulation 14. To enable the efficient investigation of money laundering, this amendment expands and strengthens the record-keeping requirements. As such, regulated businesses are now mandated to maintain all correspondence and any analysis undertaken in relation to each transaction and business relationship. This information is to be made available to the designated authority and the competent authority upon request within 7 days, as directed by the competent or designated authority so to do. In addition to improving the overall record-keeping procedures, this amendment also addresses a technical deficiency identified in the mutual evaluation report. Amendment of Regulation 18. The amendment to Regulation 18 aims to standardize the application of anti-money laundering, counter-financing terrorism policies to the overseas branches and subsidiaries of the regulated business. The inclusion of this amendment allows businesses in the regulated sector to apply appropriate measures to minimize their AML, thus CTF risk, and inform the competent authority concerned. Insertion of regulations 20. Insertion of a new regulation at 20. The regulation amendments to which include a new regulation to outline penalties applicable to contravention of certain regulations. These regulations are 7, 7A, 7B, 11, 14, 15, 16, and 17. The new regulation, of course, are particularly concerned with what they call fixed penalties. Insertion of new regulation 21. This new regulation allows for the imposition of fixed penalties on regulated business to be enforced by the competent authority. This proposal is akin to provision within the Banking Services Act 2014, which allows licensees the opportunity to discharge any liability to conviction of specified offences by payment of a fixed penalty. It is expected that such administrative sanction would apply to technical compliance issues only. Examples of offences to which a fixed penalty notice may be served include 1. Regulation 5, failure to establish programs, policies, and procedures. Regulation 7, failure to comply with identification and transaction verification procedures. Under Regulation 14, failure to comply with record-keeping requirements. Under Regulation 15, a failure to comply with requirements for internal reporting procedures. Inclusion of a new schedule. To support the proposed fixed penalty regime, a new schedule has been added which includes a prescribed fixed penalty notice. In conclusion, therefore, Mr. Speaker, I must underscore the importance of enhancing our legislative framework to address the identified weaknesses in our anti-money laundering counter-financing of terrorism systems. Alongside the amendment to the Principal Act, these regulations will satisfy some of the technical compliance issues identified in Jamaica's Mutual Evaluation Report 2017 and further strengthen the integrity of the country's domestic financial system. In summary, these amendments will strengthen our financial system in overall. Some economists, Mr. Speaker, as indicated before, estimate that over 40% of businesses within our economy operate informally. While these amendments will satisfy our international obligations, the intention is for them to be inclusive and to bring informal operations into a formal financial sector. The regulations will allow for the application of different layers of risk assessment and improve the ease of doing business, as well as provide for greater inclusion of a wider cross-section of Jamaicans in our financial sector. Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank you. Yes, sir. Colleagues.
Mr. Jackson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this set of amendment to the regulations are not controversial. As the Minister indicated, As the Minister indicated, these are follow-on amendments to the regulation from the amendments we did recently to the Poker Act and the United Nations Terrorism Act. There are just a couple items, Minister, that I I wish to draw to your attention. I was a bit concerned about the fines from the circuit court, wherein for the parish court you have the minimum, both the fines in sentence and the penalty in dollars stated for the parish courts. In the circuit court, it only refers to a fine with no limit. It's on limit. I had consultation with my legal colleague, parliamentary colleague who are legal lawyers, legally trained, and I was advised, legal lawyers too, yes. and was advised. But I have a philosophical difference, because inherently what we do is say to the court that the limit is, there's no limit, and they can impose any fine. So the parliament itself is giving that limitless authority to the courts, and it's something I believe we should seriously consider. I have a philosophical reservation with that provision. So that is one, and it of course referred to a number of the amended fines in the regulations. The second item, Minister, is Amendment 7. In Amendment 7, which refers to low-risk transactions, at 4B-A, it reads, "The business relationship or one-off transaction shall not exceed any further unless conducted with permission of and in accordance with guidelines issued by the competent authority." But in here, and it speaks to up to 2 weeks delay in transaction by that licensed authority. I believe that kind of long, especially when it relates to one-off transaction. You imagine somebody going to one of these regulated institutions, and if there is a suspicion of money laundering and so forth, the period seems to me a bit long when it is in the low risk category. So you're going to likely affect, I'm concerned more about small and medium-sized businesses where time is of the essence for those entities. So that is one item I have a little concern about. Lastly, in the schedule, Minister, it refers to the payment of the fines being made by cash at a tax office. I believe in 2019, provision should be made in the form for payments to be made online, where they could pay the money online, have the printout, and submit as proof of payment. That is on the back. In the second schedule, I think it is. On page 23, at the back of the form. How to make fixed penalty. How to pay fixed penalty. Payment may be made in cash at any collector of taxes. And it sets out what is there. There's no provision for electronic payment. So I believe if we could make some provision there, it could ensure that that facility is available to persons who have to make fixed penalty payments. Those are my few comments and observations.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Golden.
I only want to say something very brief on this, which is that it's going to be important that there be some training, public education and training in the affected industries around these new requirements. A lot of what is being put into law now has very serious consequences if you breach the provisions, and breaches can be inadvertent if people are not aware of the new requirements. And this is being done in a rush to meet a deadline, which we understand, but there's a lot of material being rammed through the legislative system very quickly, and it needs to be followed up with some amount of training I'd love to see a plain English summary of the key provisions prepared that would explain how they work, what the requirements are in plain English for practitioners who are not lawyers. When I say practitioners, I mean people in the financial sector and so on. The key requirements. Yeah. The key requirements of what they now must do to remain on the right side of the law. So I would just recommend, I think that's always a good practice, something maybe the Ministry of Justice can help with, and people appreciate it. If a little brochure or something can be disseminated electronically and people can... So that's my brief contribution. Thanks.
Let me thank my colleagues' support and note that if I begin at the end, this idea of preparing a list of key requirements, I think is an excellent idea, and I certainly undertake to have it done in conjunction with the Ministry of Justice. Indeed, this is something I'm learning. When we get new legislation, we need to maybe, do this almost routinely to ensure that the individuals and the institutions that are critical to executing them will have a full understanding. And in the case, in the amendments here and in the laws recently passed, as indicated, could have very serious consequences. I take my friends coming from South on a number of issues. In fact, let's look at this regulations as we go forward. Member on where to adjust today, but I take note of them. And what I note of is that in 5B, remember the company in the risk assessment can reduce the time. They don't have to wait 2 weeks. It's just giving them a maximum of 2 weeks. So if you have if they assess that the business is adequate, somebody and it's just that up and down informal and you have to go to a long list of requirements. Now you can in fact decide, I have enough understanding, take the risk and sign them up immediately. So there's flexibility there. And the issue of, I agree with the issue of electronic, of paying by electronic means should be addressed, but we take this up with TAJ and come back to you because tax office have to decide that. But again, that's in the modern world, a common sense activity. So these are items which are of value in just tidying up the legislation. We're bringing them to the House now. But as indicated earlier, we have taken steps to fulfill our international obligations, but they are critical to the entire suite of legislation for our own strengthening of our own legal institutions, and I move that the regulation be affirmed. Mr. Speaker.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Samuda.
Mr. Speaker, we had intended to take at this time the contribution of the member from St. Catherine Central, but I don't see her in the House, so we will proceed directly to the member from Central St. James. You want to recommit questions? All right. I ask for recommittal of questions and answers to questions.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it.
I ask for the suspension to enable us to do that at the time being passed 3 times.
Mr. Jackson. Thank you, House Leader. Speaker, I did that. I beg that at the expiration of 21 days, the question standing in my name to the Minister of National Security be provided.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I had indicated that the member wasn't in the chamber, and the member from Central St. James has kindly consented to facilitate the member from Central St. Catherine to make her presentation at this time. Yeah. Yeah, so she's going to speak now, and then you speak.
Ms. Grange.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, once again, I stand in this House. Thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, as I stand, I will speak for every woman, every child, every victim and survivor of gender-based violence, every victim of sexual offenses, every victim of domestic violence, and every child in need of care and protection. In recent times, this House has joined me in condemning violent attacks against our women and our children. Now, Mr. Speaker, we can all go further than sending statements of condemnation because your committee has presented solid proposals to give greater protection to our people and eliminate violence. I urge the House to affirm, to accept the recommendations and show our commitment to ending the violence against women and children, and redouble our efforts to making this a safer country for all of us, especially the most vulnerable in our society. Mr. Speaker, the most vulnerable group includes children under the age of 12 years, people with a physical or mental disability, elderly people over 70 years old, and pregnant women. The most vulnerable has been subjected to the most heartless, callous, horrific, and brutal crimes. The entire House has been clear that we must give the greatest protection to the most vulnerable. So we have been advocating that we need stronger laws to deal with gender-based violence, particularly sexual offenses, offenses against children and the elderly, and offenses against pregnant women. We know that pregnant women are especially at risk, Mr. Speaker. Many victims of gender-based violence report that the beatings they received started after they became pregnant. We have proposed amending legislation to include an aggravating sentencing factor when crimes are committed against those deemed to be most vulnerable. We have also proposed a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in those circumstances. I believe that these amendments will prove to be effective in deterring acts of violence against the most vulnerable, who have for too long been considered easy targets by those who would wish to prey on them. Mr. Speaker, we only have to look at the statistics to see the urgency of implementing these recommendations. 1 in every 4 women in Jamaica has experienced physical violence by a male partner. 1 in every 5 women reported being sexually abused before reaching age 18. And half of the abused women say they've never left the abusive environment. So, Mr. Speaker, across our country, women are finding ways to live with the abuse. Many of them cannot leave the abusive environment for a myriad of reasons, but we can help to get them out of the abusive home and provide protection for them. We propose to increase the fine for breaching a protection order from $10,000 to $500,000. I believe this will serve as an effective deterrent, and I think my colleagues would agree with me. Additionally, we propose to widen the category of persons who can apply for a protection order on behalf of victims to include the minister responsible for gender. Mr. Speaker, we know that some traditional beliefs militate against efforts to protect the most vulnerable. For instance, we found in the Women's Health Survey of 2016 that 31.4% of women believe that a wife is obligated to have sex with her husband whenever he wants. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we are moving to end that. And it's gender neutral, so the men don't have to worry. And I'm in full support of the proposal to amend the law to make it quite clear that no means no, even in a marriage.
So the man can say no too?
The man can say no too.
Okay. Yes, the man can say no. Yes, reluctant. What you say no, if I'm expecting coming from.
So, Mr. Speaker, this review signals a significant legislative development as it examines the technological implications of sexual exploitation in contemporary society. It indicates that I seek your protection, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the review of the Sexual Offences Act, the Offences Against the Person Act, the Domestic Violence Act, and the Child Care and Protection Act signals a significant legislative development as it examines the technological implications of sexual exploitation in contemporary society. It indicates that social media can be used as a tool in which sexual grooming of a child can take place. It therefore provides provision for the protection of the child in the digital space. Additionally, predatory sexual assault and seduction of children under 16 were also added as new offenses. The committee recommends for the establishment of a sex offenders registry to house a register database in Jamaica. So failure to register will constitute an offense which may be punishable by imprisonment. The Sexual Offences Act, the Offences Against the Persons Act, the Child Care and Protection Act, and the Domestic Violence Act will provide victims, and in particular, vulnerable victims, with greater protection from sexual offenses and increased support from the state towards its citizens. So, Mr. Speaker, I am satisfied that this review is a comprehensive one which reiterates the government's commitment to tackling the monster of gender-based violence. And I therefore invite all my parliamentary colleagues to endorse the report and become an integral part of the awareness raising which will be part of the next steps. I want to just summarize for you, Mr. Speaker, the review that has been made particularly of the Domestic Violence Act, and the fact that that piece of legislation will be carried by the Bureau of Gender Affairs, because we have had many stories to tell about women who have been experiencing difficulties when they seek protection. So the Domestic Violence Act, the broader definition of the domestic violence, will include, it's of course gender neutral language to ensure that the act caters to both sexes. I want my colleagues to listen carefully. The Domestic Violence Act is gender neutral. That's gender neutral language to ensure that the act caters to both sexes and there is no discrimination based on sex. It's also will have stricter and more severe penalties for breaches under the Domestic Violence Act. Example, failure to honor the terms of protection orders. It also will have a more comprehensive coverage of the Act to allow other persons to apply for protection orders on behalf of victims. And it's being strengthened, its institutional framework is being strengthened for the application of the DV Act, ensuring that we can enforce it. Persons with disabilities to be given priority treatment as an extremely vulnerable group. So I'm satisfied, Mr. Speaker, that the committee has done a good job in its review. And I continue to make the point that laws will only be deterrents if people believe they will not be enforced. If people believe they will be enforced, then we will have more compliance. It is one thing for us to have harsh penalties, Mr. Speaker, but to punish the perpetrators, we need convictions. And that requires people speaking up. So I'm making a special appeal. People should not turn a blind eye. They should break the silence and they should speak up and they should speak out. We continue to urge our people to do their part by speaking up and reporting crime. But we in this House, Mr. Speaker, we have a role to play by strengthening the laws, creating a deterrent, and giving greater protection to those who need it. With those words, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say we can end the violence, but it requires all of us to end the violence. And I anticipate speedy implementation of these amendments. Thank you very much.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's fine. Mr. Speaker, the report we have before us is really the output of a significant body of parliamentary work. The process began actually when I was Minister of Justice. Senator Johnson Smith had brought a motion before the Senate at the time seeking a parliamentary review of laws related to issues to do with how pregnant women were dealt with by the criminal law where they were victims of crime and similar other such matters. There is also a provision in the Sexual Offences Act which mandates that it should be reviewed within a certain period after it passes. So there was a statutory obligation on me as minister to commence that review, and I decided to join the issues that Senator Johnson Smith had raised in her motion into that statutory review and do everything together. The work began, and we had numerous meetings. The issues are wide-ranging, and there are a lot of civil society and other actors who have an interest in the issues. However, we were unable to complete the process before the end of that parliamentary, the life of that parliament. With the new parliament that came into being in March, I guess, 2016, the process recommenced under the chairmanship of the current Minister of Justice, Minister Chuck. And as has been said in the report, we had many, many meetings again. So you really have this work has been going on for 4 years or thereabouts. And what we have is a series of recommendations in here. We don't have any drafted amendment provisions yet. So for that to happen, Minister Chuck or one of his colleagues, but probably Minister Chuck, would have to bring a submission to Cabinet seeking the preparation of drafting instructions from this report that could then, once those drafting instructions are prepared, could be used to commence the drafting process, which is in itself quite a lengthy process, but an important one. Minister Grange, on the Domestic Violence Act side of it, we felt that needed further study, really, because the social issues arising out of domestic violence are significant. And we've had domestic violence legislation in Jamaica now for quite a while. The act was passed in 1995, so over 20 years, 24 years. And we felt that a lot of the issues that exist are really not so much legislative issues, but issues around the kind of support systems that women in particular need when they're victims of domestic violence, so that the legislation can have practical benefit to them. So I think that is an issue which needs to be looked at further. By what mechanism, I don't know. But I don't think we're yet at the point where we can proceed to amend the Domestic Violence Act without that further study being done. There were two bills that were tabled in this House in the name of the then Prime Minister, Most Honourable Portia Simpson Miller. They were two short bills that had been prepared at her request, arising out of some high-profile violence involving children and women, and sought to do a couple of things. First of all, provide for, in the sentencing for serious violent crime, murders and so on against women and children, that be considered an aggravating factor in sentencing, and also to provide for the family court to have jurisdiction to enforce orders that parents get parental training from the National Parenting Council or any other appropriate body that runs parenting courses, where their children are, for example, found on the streets late at night and so on. Those bills are referred to in this report because they were tabled shortly before the end of the last Parliament. They have not been revived during this Parliament. But in this report, several references are made to those bills because the provisions that are in those bills are consistent with some of the recommendations in this report. So I'm hoping that those bills will be, if not revived, but will be used in the process of whatever amendments are going to be brought forth as a result of this report. Those are my brief opening remarks. I have 4 specific areas that I want to touch on in my comments today. First of all, I want to mention a vexed issue arising out of the Child Care and Protection Act, and that relates to the jurisdiction created by the Act for the court to make correctional orders rather, in relation to children who are exhibiting what is loosely called uncontrollable behavior. Parents or guardians who are having trouble, typically with adolescents, not always, but usually adolescent children, may sometimes, in their exasperation, come to court and say, I can't look after this child. The child is running wild or whatever. And on occasion, the court will make a correctional order resulting in that child being incarcerated in a correctional facility. This issue was looked at by an interministerial committee during the last Parliament, chaired by the then Minister of Youth and Culture, a member for Southeast St. Anne. And it was considered at the time necessary to review those provisions with a view to their elimination from the law, because it was felt inappropriate that children could be locked up in prison because of uncontrollable behavior. Uncontrollable behavior is typically a manifestation of problems that child is facing, emotional, mental, or other problems. And locking them up in a correctional facility is not considered an appropriate response to that problem. As a result of that, in the interministerial review, the practice in the court of making correctional orders in respect of children who are deemed uncontrollable was substantially curtailed, although the law had not yet been amended to eliminate that provision from the Child Care and Protection Act. In the review here in this report, the decision has been not to recommend that provision be removed. But I am aware that the practice of making these correctional orders for these uncontrollable youngsters has revived itself in recent times. And I'm also aware that there is consideration being made now to testing the constitutionality of that provision in the Child Care and Protection Act, because it essentially involves the imprisonment of a child who has not committed an offense. Because the offense, which is not an offense, is that they are exhibiting uncontrollable behavior. That is not an offense. So, to my mind, I think that is an area where, when you're bringing this forward to Cabinet, Minister, have a look, and have your technical team have a look at that, because I think that provision is going to be challenged, from what I'm gathering. And I think it would be good to forestall that if possible by revisiting. What this report says is that they should be subject to some kind of, I think, psychiatric assessment or something before any order is made. But I don't think that really is a sufficient solution to the legal problem which may exist if that provision is retained in its present form. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. The issue is addressed at pages 26 to 27 of the report. Another issue which I think is important to raise relates to a somewhat unsavory topic, which is that of forced or coerced penetration of the anus of a man or a woman. Now, the law as it stands in Jamaica is that we have the so-called Barbary Law, which is, I think, section 76 of the Offences Against the Person Act, which was passed into law in Jamaica in 1864, I believe, the year before the Morant Bay Rebellion. And the way in which that section deals with the matter is, I want to bring to our Parliament's attention. Because what it does is it says that anybody who commits the abominable crime, I think, or language to that effect, of buggery, is subject to imprisonment on conviction to a term of up to 10 years. Point to note in that is, first of all, it doesn't distinguish between whether the victim is male or female, and indeed whether it is a human being or not. And it also caps the potential punishment at a 10-year sentence. It doesn't distinguish with whether, and doesn't concern itself with whether that act is consensual or not either. In the modern statute that we have dealing with sexual offences, which is the Sexual Offences Act, which was passed in 2009, We have an offense of rape, which is defined as vaginal rape involving a woman being raped in the vagina. And we have an offense of grievous sexual assault, both of which are offenses which, if tried in the circuit court, well, rape has to be tried in the circuit court, but grievous sexual assault, because it covers quite a wide range of activity, different types of activity in it, it can be prosecuted in the parish court or in the circuit court. The prosecutor can elect where to bring those proceedings. If those proceedings are brought in the circuit court, like rape, it attracts life imprisonment, subject to a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years. So if you're convicted in the circuit court of rape or grievous sexual assault, you can get up to life imprisonment, and you cannot get less than 15 years. Now, the way in which the law was drafted in 2009 excluded from grievous sexual assault forced anal penetration. In other words, forced anal penetration is not covered by the Sexual Offences Act. It is only covered by the old 1864 buggery provision in the Offence Against a Person Act. Consensual honor. So what we have is a situation in Jamaica where if you have somebody who's raped, using that word in a broad sense, in other words, forced anal penetration, the maximum penalty that person can suffer is 10 years. Whereas if the rape is vaginal, the minimum penalty is 15 years, and you can get up to life imprisonment. And that is true whether the victim is male or female. So this is an anomaly in our law, and it is, I think it fails to adequately protect young men and women in particular who may be raped anally. This was a matter which was discussed at length in the committee, but the decision was that the committee was not going to make any recommendation in relation to it, because on the advice of the Attorney General's chambers, first of all, it was felt that if we were to make any change to the law, whether to the Offence Against the Person Act or the Sexual Offences Act, it might be considered to be an implied amendment of the Barbary Law, which would then remove potentially the savings law protection that the Constitution gives that law now. So, under Section 13, subsection 12 of the Charter of Rights in the Constitution of Jamaica, no law dealing with sexual offences which was in existence before the 2011 passing of the Charter of Rights can be deemed unconstitutional. There's a savings provision for that, and that was inserted specifically, I believe, to protect the Barbary Law from any kind of challenge in court. Whether the effectiveness of that savings has not yet been tested in court. Yeah. But the result of it is that because we are so concerned not to lose that protection that the Barbary Law enjoys under the Constitution from challenge in court, we have, having had a very extensive review of sexual offences by the Joint Select Committee, we have, as a committee, and I wasn't actually on the committee towards the end, because when I became a member of Parliament and left the Senate, I came off the committee, but I continued to attend the meetings because I had been involved in it closely from its inception. But the fact is that the committee has basically, in effect, washed its hands of the issue and said in the report, this is for Parliament as a whole to consider and decide. I just think that we ought to be aware that that is what the report says, because the law as it stands now does not, in my view, protect vulnerable persons who may be subject to forced anal penetration, whether they be men or women, little boys or little girls, or adults. And because the sentencing options are so different than what would apply in the case of rape of a woman. I don't think that is a sustainable approach to take, but again, it is for the Parliament to decide whether it wants to tackle this or not. We were also told by the Attorney General's chambers that this was an issue which the government was intent on dealing with through a referendum. The government has been in office for nearly more than 3.5 years now. We have heard nothing about this referendum. My recollection was it was supposed to be a grand referendum that was going to deal with this issue, ganja legalization, and I don't remember what else. But we've heard nothing more on that. Whether this referendum will ever take place, I do not know. But in the meantime, our law is in an unsatisfactory state because it does not provide reasonable protection to persons who might be victims of that kind of violence, sexual violence against them. The third point I wanted to make relates to the offense in the Sexual Offences Act of having sex with someone who is under the age of 16. The law currently it's a strict liability criminal offense. If you have sex with somebody under the age of 16, whether they be male or female, and regardless of what your age is, you are committing a serious criminal offense. This has resulted in a lot of young teenage boys being brought to court to be prosecuted for essentially teenage promiscuity, precocious sexual conduct, not involving any kind of force or duress. It might be boyfriend and girlfriend or just teenagers experimenting or whatever. Invariably, I'm told it's the boys who are prosecuted, not the girls. So it has an implicit gender bias in the way that it operates in practice. And there has been a kind of informal diversion process where in certain circumstances, if the boy is put through a course of real counseling and the like, but if the circumstances are not considered to warrant that, that arrangement is not made available and the matter goes to court. And it's a very serious issue because it's a serious criminal offense. It attracts a potentially very serious penalty, and it is also an offense which I believe can lead to you being in the sex offenders register after you have served your time. So what this report has recommended, which I think is a very critical aspect of the report, is a close-in age exemption. So where the person who's having sex or the two people are not more than 4 years apart, and it is consensual, then they are referred in certain circumstances to the child diversion program, and they are not liable to be prosecuted. And I think that needs to be enacted as soon as possible, Minister, because that is long overdue. When the Sexual Offences Act was passed in 2009, I said in the Senate then that this was going to criminalize conduct that many teenagers engage in, and which is really not, I think, appropriately criminalized. So I'm pleased that we have... Yes. Yes. I can see a few members of Parliament who are looking somewhat forlorn, thinking back at what they were like when they were teenagers, no doubt. And the last point I wanted to highlight Mr. Speaker, relates to a recommendation for a new offense called predatory sexual assault. Predatory sexual assault. This is an important new provision which I hope will be enacted quickly, because to my mind it is dealing with what the offense that I just mentioned, the underage sex, really was designed to, was aimed at, but it was too broadly couched so that in its original form it caught conduct which really ought not to be criminalized. This new offense, which is recommended here, of predatory sexual assault, will essentially tackle where adults have sex with vulnerable victims under the age of 12, a child under 12, for example, or somebody suffering from a mental disorder. And it will attract a stiff sentence of up to, I think, life imprisonment is a recommendation here. So when enacted, that provision will provide serious protection against sexual predators, and I think that's a very good thing. One thing I would mention, Minister, is that we have to bear in mind, and I don't know the answer to this, but a thought that came into my head when I read the provision again in the report last night was that if you have persons who have an intellectual impairment, who I don't think they should be treated in the same way, because I know, for example, of a couple of persons who are Down syndrome who got married, for example, who are now married, legally married. So I'm just saying, when the drafting is being done, I think we need to consider that persons with intellectual disabilities can have legitimate sexual relationships, and they shouldn't inadvertently be caught by this predator provision. And that can be solved by appropriate drafting, but I just wanted to mention it here. But overall, I think that recommendation is where I think the country would like to see us go to protect our children, young children, from sexual predators. So, Mr. Speaker, this report has a lot in it. It covers a wide range of activity, and we look forward to seeing some of the provisions being brought as legislation to this House in due course. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chuck.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from St. Andrews South and also the member from St. Catherine Central for their contribution to the debate on the report on the Sexual Offences Act, along with the Domestic Violence Act and the Child Care and Protection Act. Mr. Speaker, both members have highlighted some issues which were brought out in the open, plus additional issues which are impatient of debate in terms of new legislation or enforcement and increased fines to protect the vulnerable in our society. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the member from Central St. Catherine pointed out that a fair amount of the report and the debate, and I would say, Mr. Speaker, in the committee itself, first chaired by the former Minister of Justice, the member from St. Andrews South, and then after by myself, there were very good presentations from civil society, from government organization, and also when we met to debate the final recommendations, we had very spirited debates. Many of the recommendations that we proposed were unanimous, a few were majority. But the end result, Mr. Speaker, is that after this long period of gestation, of first of all of the select committee meetings, presentations, then recommendations, and then finally the report having sat in the House since December last year, it's important for us to close it and to indicate what we hope to do with this report. So, Mr. Speaker, the member from Central St. Catherine pointed out that our women in particular, the vulnerable members in our society, children, elderly, but women, are regularly abused. It is something, Mr. Speaker, that we, the parliamentarians, and I would say, Mr. Speaker, all the upright members of our society should speak out against more fully, that we must stop the abuse of our elderly, of our children, and of our women. It is, Mr. Speaker, if we are going to be a good society, we must really protect our women, not abuse them. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, in short order, we hope to improve the necessary legislations so that the penalties can be increased to send the appropriate signal to those who abusive men that our women must be protected. And therefore, I will assist the Minister of Gender Affairs so that these orders, these new bills can come to Cabinet and then to the House. But in addition, Mr. Speaker, the protection orders, which the Minister indicated, will now be regularly enforced because far too many protection orders are not properly enforced, and the women who are abused, even after they take out the protection orders, they still have to cower in fear. And in those circumstances, Mr. Speaker, provisions will be made to ensure that our women get adequate protection, and hopefully that these protection orders can carry the weight that they're supposed to carry. So, Mr. Speaker, this is something which is important. So, amendments to the legislation will be forthcoming to protect our women, the elderly, and our children. And the next one, Mr. Speaker, very shortly, we will amend the Sexual Offences Act so that rape can occur in marriage. So in marriage, rape must now only will be non-consensual sex, so that it can occur outside and inside of marriage. And that requires, Mr. Chairman, an amendment to the Sexual Offences Act. And admittedly, this is something that the common law had upheld, that you could not commit rape in marriage, but now legislation will overturn that common law position. I agree, Mr. Speaker, with the member from Central St. Catherine that we must speak up and encourage exposure of abuse within our society, especially of the vulnerable. And in those circumstances, these vulnerable persons within our society, the elderly, children and pregnant women, and others who are abused, we must ensure that the abuse stop as soon as possible and that they do not continue. I want to thank, Mr. Speaker, the member from St. Andrews South who, well, yes, if abuse continue, then punishment will be necessary and will be imposed. Because, Mr. Speaker, it happens. And that is why we're now putting in place 3 shelters to protect abusive women. Because even though abused women, even though protection orders are in place, the men still abuse them. And so we are going to find shelters for them. And the Minister of Gender Affairs has arranged for shelters so that these abused women can be protected from these abusive men. So that is something which will happen, but we hope it will cease in due time. Now, Mr. Speaker, the member from St. Andrews South, who was a participant in most of these debates, was present at most of the meetings, have pointed out some very important points to note, and these will be brought into play. In particular, Mr. Speaker, the Child Care and Protection Act, where children, and remember, I was told recently in St. Elizabeth, I was there at child diversion, and the UNICEF representative, I did mention uncontrollable children, and the UNICEF member said, UNICEF no longer speak of uncontrollable. So we must not speak of children being uncontrollable. So I'm just bringing it to the Parliament children who need help and guidance. And in speaking in St. Elizabeth recently, Mr. Speaker, these children who really are out of control, and the parents take them to the police, take them to court, and are institutionalized, it is wrong. And that is where, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at the child diversion bill so that mentoring, psychiatric or psychological care can be given to these young children instead of institutionalizing them. Because once we institutionalize them without the care, the psychological care, there's no question that they will deteriorate. So, member, I want to tell you that within the child diversion operation, which we're hoping to come into play, the bill will be brought into play this month, that these children will now be taken under due care and protection by the child diversion officer with the assistance of the parish diversion committee, and we hope they will no longer be institutionalized. So when that is done, we are hoping that we will also correct that provision you pointed out, which, as you quite rightly point out, may well be unconstitutional. In relation to your second point on the forced penetration of the anus, it's a matter which, in my opening, I said, it's a controversial matter, which, as you quite rightly pointed out, could affect Clause 13.12, I think, of the Constitution, and therefore it is a matter that Parliament, the recommendation was that at the appropriate time, Parliament must take that on and determine how to go. But the recommendation of the committee was not to make any recommendation, to leave it to Parliament.
That's a recommendation?
Yes, to leave it to Parliament. And that still remains the case. Now, your third point, member, was sex with minors, and the position you quite rightly point out, that under the Child Diversion Act, minors are 16 and under. Sex amongst minors, so that once the minors are 16 and under, they will now come under the Child Diversion Act, so that they will no longer necessarily get a conviction. If they're brought to court, the court under the Child Diversion Act will refer them to the child diversion officer, and hopefully they will be able to go along the straight and narrow path. Now, if one of the participants, the male in particular, is over 16, the male cannot come under the Child Diversion Act because it is for 16 and under. But we have recommended, Mr. Speaker, that there is a close age range, so that if in fact there's the female and the male, or vice versa, is within a 4-year range, then it is a defense. So, as I pointed out in my opening, if the female is 15 and the male is 18, once it is proven that it is within 4 years, as 15 and 18, then it's a defense. But if the male is over 4 years, and here, Mr. Speaker, we have to tread carefully, if the male and the female, so if it is 12, for example, and 17, then immediately there's a problem, because the close range is 4 years. And to that extent, legislation might well have to give the court some discretion if it is clearly children of tender age. 2 13-year-old child diversion. Child diversion. Once they're under 16 and under, child diversion. But you're looking at the situation where it could be 13 and 17, 13 and 18, and therefore the 4-year range would have been breached. And there, I suspect, we might well leave it to the discretion of the court. So, Mr. Speaker, the point to note, which could be coordinated with the fourth point that the member from St. Andrews South mentioned, is that if it looks like consensual, the court should have a discretion. But if it is, as he pointed out, predatory, that it's a male stalking or the female, and it is clearly rape, then it, in those circumstances, must be carnal abuse or rape. So in those circumstances, the bill that is drafted will come back to Parliament, or the amendment, and so Parliament will have an opportunity to debate all these changes which will take place, Mr. Speaker. But in the interim, I'm asking the House to approve the report so that the legislation committee or the CPC can know, or the various ministries can put in cabinet submission so that we can do some drafting. With those remarks, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the report be it resolved that the report of the Joint Select Committee appointed to complete the review of the Sexual Offences Act, along with the Offences Against the Person Act, the Domestic Violence Act, and the Child Care and Protection Act, laid in this House on the 11th day of December 2018, be approved.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we now will turn to the resolution in the name of the Member of Parliament for Central St. James, and I'm sure that it's a resolution that most of us in here are looking forward to hear his views on it. And so I ask you to invite the honourable member from St. James to make his contribution.
Mr. Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, I rise once again in this hallowed chamber to speak on the motion that is in my name. I speak today, Mr. Chairman, not on behalf of myself, but on the behalf of the voiceless. Mr. Speaker, in this situation, Mr. Speaker, it is those who we refer to as small farmers, the liquorman, Rastaman Israel, Rastaman Ezekiel, and Billy, the former worker of the Den Beach Village in Negril, Westmoreland. Mr. Speaker, the motion is as it relates to cannabis cultivation. I speak with emotion, I speak with sentiment, because I can relate somewhat, Mr. Chairman, as a youngster growing up in Western Westmoreland, who at that time knew nothing else, Mr. Chairman, than farming. My grandfather, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, cultivated callaloo, cabbage, tomato, yam. He was a very avid Christian, Mr. Speaker. But I know of other persons who have been persecuted, Mr. Chairman, for growing the then, Mr. Speaker, the cannabis, as it is called today. It goes by many different names. Some people say sense, some people say Cali, some people call it high grade, some people call it purple cushion. Whatever the name is, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker.
Vegetable matter.
It is, Mr. Speaker, that they at this stage of the game must benefit from what is happening. Mr. Speaker, today, as we are learning, cannabis production is getting to a stage of being very profitable legally. Hence, Mr. Speaker, those who spent years in jail, in prison, for planting the same weed, those who have lived a life without a clean police record because they saw nothing else to do at the time, then, Mr. Speaker, I am saying today that we as a government must make sure that they get a piece of the pie. Mr. Speaker, I am calling on the Honorable Minister, Minister Arthur Shaw and his team, to find a way to hold the hands of these voiceless people, the small farmer, to make sure that they are not left out in the cold. Mr. Speaker, I got some information from the Cannabis Licensing Authority. Mr. Speaker, I was taken aback when I was told that it is $1 million Jamaican dollars for any farmer to register. Mr. Speaker, if a small farmer had $1 million that he could register that farm, Mr. Speaker, then he wouldn't need to plant any of it. Just to register. To obtain the license to register. Whatever it is, Mr. Speaker, I am asking this Honorable House to speak to those who are in authority, to say to them, I take correction, to instruct them forthwith to make sure that the small farmers, the Israel from out in Farm Pen in Westmoreland, the Billy from Sheffield, Westmoreland, the Ezekiel from Orange Hill get a chance to smile and to say, our work has not been vain. Mr. Speaker, far too long, the small man pays the price while the big man collects the profit. Today, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to stand with me and to make it known not only to this sovereign state, but to the world, that we are standing in support of our small farmers as it relates to being a part and enjoying the cannabis profit. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know, but I have not seen anyone from the opposition
We'll talk on it, but not today. I don't talk earlier.
signaling their intention to speak. I do know that the member from Southwest St. Andrew had intended to speak on the resolution. So I'm going to ask that the resolution not be closed today, the debate not be closed today, but we can have her contribute next week, and others who may wish to speak on this matter. Yes, she's coming back from all those who, the people that he's talking about. So, Mr. Speaker, The final item for today will be a resolution that was, a motion that was tabled in this House.
Mr. House Leader, I think you have gone a bit too far.
No.
In terms of asking for the...
You can ask the members for the...
Yes, for the Those in favor of the suspension of the debate resolution tabled by Member Clarke, Mr. Clarke. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. House Leader.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to invite the member from South Manchester to make his presentation on the resolution standing in his name.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand here in this honorable House, Mr. Speaker, to speak on the resolution that is tabled in my name, and I'll just read it for refreshing the minds of this honorable House. Whereas the Jamaica Library Service has provided monumental support to the Jamaican education system, and by extension, the enhancing of the research skills of students and other citizens over the years. And whereas the branch libraries in several deep rural communities have also played a fundamental role in assisting students to do their assignments, projects, and other school-related activities. And whereas some of these branch libraries are meeting places for active community discussions and research centers for community members. And whereas there are plans in the pipeline to close many of these branch libraries across the country, which will deprive thousands of students and other citizens who use these facilities to do their research and other educational activities. Be it resolved that the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information clearly state its position with regard to the closure of branch libraries in our deep rural communities. Be it further resolved that discussions be held with the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology to assist in equipping these libraries with the necessary technological devices to ensure that these entities remain open. And be it further resolved that this Honourable House debate the issue surrounding parish libraries and branch libraries to ensure that these research-based centers remain open to the general public. Mr. Speaker, the motion under consideration speaks for itself. Public libraries, and more so our branch libraries, are regarded as the bedrock of our education system. They provide a place where our students, adults, and other persons go to do research on various topics. Persons visit these places to read for relaxation. The libraries provide a place to discuss social, cultural, political, religious, and economic issues. It is a place where you get facts, not fake news. Mr. Speaker, in many cases, these libraries are referred to as the poor man's university. These libraries are therefore still relevant despite the growing use of technological devices such as smartphones. Mr. Speaker, we have seen in recent times that there are several attempts to close some of these branch libraries and scale down the work of the parish libraries across the country by starving them of human and financial resources. Mr. Speaker, this lack of resources is spelling the death knell of branch libraries across the country. Staff members are frustrated because they're unable to function to their full capacity based on their training. Mr. Speaker, it is clearly understood that libraries are not income-generating entities, but they serve a vital purpose. We must reflect on the social good that these libraries bring to a harmonious, peaceful, and cohesive society. And so, Mr. Speaker, instead of closing these branch libraries, we should be opening more, especially in our deep rural communities. Public libraries exist in many countries across the world and are often considered as essential to having an educated and literal population. Mr. Speaker, the education system has benefited significantly from these branch libraries. The communities have also benefited. Our constituencies have benefited. Jamaicans have benefited. I know that the citizens of Lancaster, Crosskeys, Porus, and Newport in South Manchester, where these branch libraries are located, are grateful for these facilities as they have benefited. The mobile libraries, which provided critical services in many deep rural communities, are almost extinct because of the 13 mobile libraries across the country. Only 6 are still operating and are limping. Mr. Speaker, the Sunday Gleaner of October 20, 2019, published a very heart-rending story entitled "Starved for Cash, Public Libraries Limping on Meager Budget." The article further stated that there are some 116 libraries across Jamaica, and the public network receives less than a tenth of the budget needed to sustain them. Mr. Speaker, libraries are important cornerstones of healthy communities. They are educational institutions. They provide educational programs, especially during the summer holidays. They are engaged in reading competitions, spelling competitions, essay writing competitions, dictations, in which our young people display their intellectual capacity, and the tactile capacity of several students are developed at these branch libraries through art. These branch libraries are the lifeblood of several small rural communities and must remain open. I humbly request that the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, which has direct responsibility for public libraries, find the necessary resources to ensure that the doors of these critical institutions remain open. Mr. Speaker, we can do no less for our citizens and our deep rural communities, and by extension, Jamaica. The Social and Economic Survey, which was recently published, has shown that we are nowhere near full literacy, and so we should be opening more branch libraries and providing more support for the parish libraries. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Mr. Speaker, fortuitously, the person responsible for education is in the House. And I am sure that he will make every effort to bring a sense of enlightenment to the subject. But before I say anything, I must commend the member for his obvious commitment to the subject and for bringing the matter to the House and to giving it the additional exposure that is necessary. I don't view contributions like that as in any way controversial, but I welcome it because it gives us an opportunity to become even more familiar with the subject and to examine the deficiencies that may exist with a view to improving them. So thank you. The fact of the matter, however, Mr. Speaker, is that indeed the library service is one of the most important in the country. It is quite extensive because there are, as was mentioned by the member, 116 public libraries, and they support approximately 890 odd government school libraries. So the library service is broad-based and very extensive. The organization has embarked on a strategic review of the island-wide network to greater enable us to greater obtain the levels of efficiency that obtain in each of these facilities. What we are trying to do, Mr. Speaker, we can't do it all at once. But by and large, the library service in Jamaica is in reasonably good shape. But there are some that are experiencing challenges. 14 branch libraries are under review to identify the options for strengthening the programs and services offered by these libraries. 3 branch libraries, there are 3 categories of branch libraries. There is the low usage due to its location. That's one classification. Inadequate physical infrastructure, so that it's deficient in many respects. Insufficient collection to efficiently and effectively deliver library programs and services. The question of mobility and the retrieval of books that are used and the whole business of running a library in an efficient manner. So all the branches that remain open today maintain a satisfactory, note the word, satisfactory standard of service delivery to communities through the support of the Ministry of Education. Satisfactory. What we hope to achieve at the end of this review is an improvement and an upgrading of the facilities of all our libraries. Mr. Speaker, that is the reason why we asked and received in the budget, in the supplementary estimates, $169 million, which was allocated to carry out the repairs and upgrade of these libraries this fiscal year. So, whilst there could be more, as there always is, the fact is that we will be spending rounded off $170 million for the library services this year. The repairs and upgrading will take various forms. Physical infrastructure, including major roofs, and nothing can be worse than a library that leaks because of the value of the books and the need to have them properly secured. Major repair works, especially to Kingston and St. Andrew Parish Library, to reopen some spaces that I believe are now closed. Those are to be reopened. This is the Tom Redcombe, affectionately known as the Tom Redcombe Library, which needed upgrading. These funds will also be used to pay outstanding tuition refunds and to purchase books and other resources for 116 locations, both printed matter and electronic, and to also enhance the ICT infrastructure and software upgrade. We will also seek to replace equipment to enhance document services, purchase of vehicles for libraries that are currently without vehicles. So the mobility that is required to serve the library is in some cases not present. The question asked is or the suggestion made, is that some of these libraries have closed. And even those that are not totally closed, during the course of the repairs, will they be closed? Some libraries or sections of libraries, of course, will be closed during the period when the work is being undertaken, but only temporarily. And these include the Kingston and St. Andrew Parish Library, the Westmoreland Parish Library, the Stony Hill Branch Library, the St. James Parish Library, St. Thomas Parish Library, and Pennance Branch Library, Pennance, and James Hill Branch Library. Those will be. Now, Mr. Speaker, the strategic review of which I speak will affect the following. In Portland, the Mount Pleasant Branch Library. In Manchester, as you mentioned, Cross Keys Branch Library and the Lancaster Branch Library. These are going to be repaired. Yes, and we're doing the review to determine exactly where the priorities are, because our intention is to utilize the funds as broadly as we can, because in some instances it is a sense of urgency, and it is hardly any wonder that there is commentary about it. So we're seeking Cross Keys Branch Library and Lancaster Branch Library. These are the ones that we are now engaged in reviewing what is required to correct the problems there. In St. Anne, Sturge Town Branch Library, Runaway Bay Branch Library, Mount Zion Branch Library. In St. Catherine, Point Hill Branch Library, Riversdale Branch Library. That is the member from Northeast who is preoccupied now with the member from Trelawney. Westmoreland, Beeston Spring Branch Library, St. James, Springfield Branch Library. Yeah, in Westmoreland there's only Beeston Spring Branch Library. Should you identify other areas in great need, please don't hesitate to communicate it. Now, I don't have Bugwalk here for St. Catherine. I have Point Hill, and I have Riversdale. And in St. James, there is the Springfield Branch Library. Member National Security Minister's area, I suspect. And in Hanover, there is the Pondside Branch Library. I don't know the location, Pondside. And Chatham Branch Library, those are in Hanover. So those really are the 12 branch libraries that have been assessed as being in need of immediate attention. And so we are doing those reviews now to determine precisely the extent, and we are going to be using these funds that we got in the supplementary to address the problem. But should any member here identify additional problems that confront other libraries that you'd like us to look at and attend to the best of our ability at this time, please don't hesitate. So, member, I can assure you that I feel very strongly about the need for properly run and properly managed library services in the country. And if we are going to build the kind of student cohort that we are working so hard to achieve, then the library service is an essential part of that development. Our objective in the Ministry of Education, while I'm on my feet, I would just explain very briefly. Through the PEP that we heard, those letters, PEP, through the, not political endangered, all right, exposed, but through the PEP exams, we have been able to separate those students who are beginning, classified as beginning, and others who are classified as developing. They are the lowest rank. There's a pathway 1, pathway 2, and pathway 3. Pathway 2 deals with the developing. Pathway 3 deals with beginning. Now, I must tell you that majority of those in pathway 3 have challenges with reading and writing and comprehension. They are really challenged, and they virtually are the ones who are left behind. They are followed by the beginning category. And what we have done is identified those children specifically where they are located. And we have assigned special teachers and coaches to deal with the areas that they are deficient, that has been able to be detected through the exams that were taken, which served to place them in certain schools. And because there is this inequity in the system, we are using certain strategies to give everyone a fair point of start, so that to get them up to the level where they are proficient, where they can begin to absorb training, disseminate information, think for themselves, and move on. And so, of course, it will depend on the longevity of my stay in the ministry. And in the business of politics, you are taught never to project too far in the future. But I am confident nonetheless. I am confident nonetheless that I will get the opportunity to continue to serve in this area. But the objective is that all students in categories 2 and 3 will cease to exist in those categories within 2 years. That is the objective. So that when we have these children coming out of the primary school system and they are placed in schools, in high schools, we can be assured of their likely success based on the level of preparation and the level of comprehension that they have, through the additional work that we'll be doing on them, focusing on them, so that they all are brought up to the same standard. From there on, it's a question of application and dedication to the subject matter that they are being taught. But at least they must all be exposed to equal opportunity. And it is this imbalance, in my view, that has led to a lot of the problems that we face in the country, in terms of the quality of labor that we provide, the problems that the Minister of National Security has to live with. It all stems from a lack of adequate preparation at the pre-primary and primary level. And we are seeking to use all means at our disposal to arrest these deficiencies so that the children of Jamaica can get a good and fair chance in life. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to welcome the motion by my colleague from South Manchester and the response of the Minister is very timely. It is timely, Minister, because it allows the revelation that the Greater Portmore Branch Library the largest branch library in Jamaica. Built the largest branch library in Jamaica. It is larger than the parish library. The Greater Portmore branch library is larger than the St. Catherine Parish Library in Spanish Town. Mr. Speaker, we saw it at the very inception in the late 1990s when that branch library was built. First set of books I provided as a Member of Parliament. Computers were subsequently provided. Long and short of it, Mr. Speaker, the physical building is in need of urgent repairs. I had a meeting about a month ago with the regional officer for the library service and the branch library manager, and they are distressed. They have tried, Minister, to get the attention of their parent office, and Minister, I would love to take you there tomorrow afternoon. The convenience is that it's 15 minutes drive from here to where the library is. You have to see it to believe it. Mr. Speaker, regrettably, one of our failures as a country is that we have not maintained vital, well-developed design infrastructure at the community level on an ongoing basis. And this goes across political administration. So we build something good and useful, and it is gradually allowed to deteriorate. Now, Greater Portmore, as we all know, is the largest housing settlement, formal housing settlement in the English-speaking Caribbean. We have been trying to keep the infrastructure there, the other physical infrastructure, roads, drains, and so forth, up to par as best. Social infrastructure like the library is a critical one. And at a time, Minister, when we are even more concerned as a country, I believe now, about our young people, and especially those who are unattached or those on the edge of being unattached, to make sure that the community facilities are in place to engage them. It is urgent, Minister, that this facility be given some attention with a sense of haste. We have two high schools, the Greater Portmore High School, Ascot High School, and we have a number of primary schools surround the library. Greater Portmore Primary School, Kensington Primary School, Belmont Park Primary School, Brayton Primary School, all in close proximity to the library. It's right beside a junior center. Point I'm trying to make, it is located at a central point where young people can easily access it. It is imperative that we make it as functional as is possible so that the young people can find it useful and attractive to engage themselves with so that we can lessen the distraction for undesirable activities for our young people. So, Minister, I want to use this opportunity to say, put Greater Portmore Branch Library and others, including Bagwalk, that want this attention. I am prepared, Minister, to whatever bit I can do as a Member of Parliament, like you said, I don't have much at my disposal with all the other demands. But I am prepared to partner with you if we can sign off on a menu of things, starting with the most urgent one, like the physical building. We need some computers inside there, etc. I am prepared to partner with you to make this become a reality in the shortest possible time. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, one would not believe that such a simple motion, sincere, moved by the member from South Manchester, would elicit a lot of responses. But every single member of Parliament in this House who is
close to their communities and their youths and their education system, their schools and their teachers, would know that this resolution is timely. And I would like to commend the member for bringing the motion to the House. I commend him. Not very often we talk about these simple things, the library, the postal agency. These are things that affect the ordinary, simple man and woman at the grassroots level on a day-to-day basis. I remember as a youngster growing up in Vera, on a Saturday, my excursion with my group would be to the Maypen Parish Library, Clarendon Parish Library in Maypen. You had to be silent, you get your book, and the pleasure was to sign out your book and you have to take it back on time. So discipline started developing kids. What has happened, Minister, and I want to wish you a permanent stay. You know, but not for long. Permanently appointed, but short tenure. Minister, the truth is, and if we are to say it, the Jamaica Library Service has always been taken for granted. And as the member said, across successive administrations. When they come before the Standing Finance Committee, you don't even listen to what they have to say. They're begging for like a support here, support there. And I tell you, we have to change that. Because the deterioration in behavior, attitude, literacy, discipline among young people can be traced, you know. You check anywhere where that library and that librarian was, the respect for her or the respect for him, and look at the performance in those areas. You see that there's a difference. We all in this chamber support the Jamaica Library Service. There are some libraries that are built, and I'm not sure, you may ask your people, basically managed by churches. There are some libraries that are on church property, and some churches have used their properties and the library had to be closed or removed. And in closing the library, there's not convenient locations to relocate these libraries. I suggest you check, and in your next report tell us which one of these are connected to the various churches. I think the Cayman and the, what is it called again? Church of Grand Cayman and what? United Church of Grand Cayman and whatever. No, it's one of those churches that usually have libraries. I'm glad the minister, as he usually does, touch on another subject, which is the PEP. And I had wanted for some time. I just asked the member from South Manchester if a report was tabled in the House on the performance of PEP, and he said it was tabled. I don't remember, I collect all of my documents. But it is to the credit of the teachers that they had gone through this first new exercise called the PEP. In the middle of turmoil, new minister had to resign, permanent secretary relocated, and all these things. But the teachers of Jamaica who were preparing for the PEP kept focus, and they did an excellent job, and we have never been able to tell them thanks. This is a new exam, and they really went out of their way, the teachers of Jamaica, and successfully executed the PEP. Those students who are in the categories you mentioned, there has to be some connection with the library service. There has to be some connection with taking them to the library. Part of their schedule should be going to sit down and read, because we have seen some of us who bother to look at the performance of our schools see the warped nature of the performance among some of our kids, and we try our best to intervene. But unless you have a situation where teachers are based in the communities, Students are taken to schools. I was sharing with my colleagues the other day, I went to a school for Boys' Day, just about the same time of the PEP, just to encourage them. And after school, every single teacher left the community. They went down to Maypen. There's a school in my constituency. There's no teacher that remain in the district. When the youngster coming from school and doing something rude, they saw Miss coming and say, Mister, come there, behave yourself. Say, sir, there. Everybody jump in them car or take them taxi and head back down to Maypen. And I'm saying we have to now incentivize teachers who are prepared to be based in the community where they are teaching. Because that community, teacher, pastor, used to be a role model in those communities, but they're not there. But I know your commitment to education. I say it publicly. I know you love the job. I see you move with agility at times to try and solve some problems. I do hope while I'm on my feet that very quickly the impasse at the University of Technology will be settled. I realize over a week the kids are out of school, and we hope that that will be settled. Once again, I commend the member for bringing the motion and for bringing us the update on the Jamaica Library Service Minister. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I also rise to support the motion from the member from South Manchester with regards to the library service. And I sat there, Minister, eagerly listening to see if a Not Bay library was on that list. A Not Bay library literally faces eviction, closure, and therefore I'm asking you to look specifically at this library. I also would like to say that notwithstanding the changes in library service right across the world, moving to a digital platform, I believe that the place is still here for library and library services. And I believe that library services should transition into not just a place where books are read, but homework center and or a multi-use facility. Because another member mentioned the postal service, because this is also dying. And I believe that if we that offer these multi-use purposes, then we could find a place for the postal service and the library service. I believe there are other areas, especially in Southeast St. Mary, in Belfield, in Castleton, in Richmond, where there's just no library service. That instead of the library services being under the pressure that they are, we should be looking at expanding it into these deep rural areas, because they offer an avenue where persons can in fact go and learn, do their homework, and become productive young men and citizens. So I thank the member for that presentation, and I think all of us stand readily to support him on this particular journey. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology supports the upgrading of libraries to repurpose them by infusing technology, which would consist of computers, connectivity, facility to print, and so on. Across Jamaica, the libraries have historically served as study locations, but with wider connectivity available across Jamaica, we've seen a reduction in their usage. As you well know, and as members well know, we do not yet have broadband connectivity available to all communities across Jamaica. And so until that time, we have to continue to utilize our libraries and continue to support them by making them more technology enabled. Through the Universal Service Fund, the libraries, community centers are physical locations that are targeted for upgrading for the ones that already have computers, that already have connectivity,
or as I've been getting requests from MPs for new locations. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member from South Manchester for raising this, but it is definitely within the purview of the ministry. And again, we support the upgrading of libraries across Jamaica so that they are infused with technology and available to all the young men and women in our communities for studies, for completing job applications, for just learning, for downloading whatever it is that they would like to download to enable them to do homework, write letters, stay in touch, and overall to become more digitally literate and digitally savvy. So thank you, member, and the ministry stands ready to continue what it's doing in the community centers and the libraries.
Mr. Henry.
I have been, as I rise to laud the resolution, I'm going to be very brief, but I couldn't sit and not anticipate that I had to say something, as my life has been so tied up in books. And it would be remiss of me on the side of government not to intervene here and speak to some of the realities in a very brief and spontaneous way. The genesis of libraries lies very much in the publishing and printing industry. It lies in the genesis that related to how that industry was integrated into the knowledge-based structure of our conquerors. In that context, therefore, I'm going to be only saying to you, to your resolution and to the government, that we must engage the printing and publishing industry, who has to benefit most from the resuscitation of libraries and books. And therefore, that creates an interest that I have to take, and I would lead at any point in time. Because indeed, books are making a comeback. And in the context of it is how you now integrate the new development in terms of media and communications. That's going to be very important. And without wanting to gild the lily but really deal with the reality, I remind the ministry at the moment that also the public printing industry and the book industry suffers from photocopying, which is part of an invasion of the intellectual property rights of all of this, which is very important. In fact, there's an outstanding, Mr. Minister, right now, conflict in terms of that and jam copy for 34 million, which could be resuscitated back into it, if it came to the publishers, could be put back into the industry, and we begin to take some responsibility for the actual material that's going to be used. So I laud the resolution. I support the resolution, but as my colleague here spoke to, it's how we integrate now the utilization of that space and how you link that. And as I said, I would be remiss of me not to think of some people like Dr. Joyce Robinson, who built the Jamaica Library Service structure, the mobile movement of libraries, etc. And therefore say we must build on solid ground, and in this case, the solid ground we inherit were the libraries, part of that colonial structure which is we inherited and which we must now build on for getting not fake news, but the real news, and also use it to outlet how the material we produce about our history and our time. And therefore it's important for us, and I'm going to take it on myself to raise it with the publishing industry as to how we can look on it and how we can see how we can integrate that development to ensure that the libraries are sustainable and usable, and we integrate now the intellectual rights of funds that must come from the various forms in which we move it from the print to more the interpretive level, the apps that can relate to it, and how we spread our own history. So I laud you on the presentation, and the support must come from the industry itself by proper planning and projections of where we go.
Mr. Speaker, I stand to also...
Go ahead, member.
I stand to support this motion. I have to say, growing up in a small town, I also grew up going to the library quite often, especially in the summertime. and reading at least, running competition between ourselves, trying to see how many books we could read for the summer. I don't see that happening now, and I think it's dying. And so I'm very pleased to hear that Stony Hill is on the list to be refurbished, because the last time I visited the library, there was a sinkhole in the library at this time, and it's in a container. I would want to also, I hope that, I'm not sure how they're going to refurbish this, but I would possibly want a new location for this library because of where it's situated at this time. And so I want to say I'm totally in approval of this motion and would like to see more libraries in our, especially rural towns as we know it. Stony Hill is urban rural, but I think I would want to see the days come again where children are having competition against each other to say how many books they're reading for the summer, or even for the schools to give them that kind of a homework to say, read at least 3 or 4 books for the summer. So I'm totally in approval of this motion.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the intention of it is to prolong the debate, so I'll contribute to it as well. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that all of us inside this House and many on the outside owe our very existence and education to what the library service has offered over the years. In spite of new technologies that have come along, in spite of the fact that we are in the ICT age and there's greater access with the cell phone, with the computer, with the tablets, the library creates an environment where there is a greater need to learn and a greater attention paid to reading. We have been told that reading maketh the man and the woman. The reality, though, Mr. Speaker, is that in many of our communities where the need for the library exists, we do not have those services. In many communities that are out there crying out for some sort of social intervention, a library or a collection or a place where people can get together and reason, learn, read will help to prevent some of those social ills that we have in this country. And I think, Mr. Speaker, the motion moved by the member from Manchester South is timely. I want to commend him for that. And I want to also say to the other members who have contributed, and those who have not too, because all our hearts are in this particular motion, that the minister, and he has indicated that where there's a need, he will address it. He has declared that, as all of us have, that the library plays a pivotal role in the development of our people and our country. And I am in full support of the resolution, the motion, and I am asking that in all areas, as we can help as members of parliament to ensure that this program continues, that this library service continues, that we give it our full support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Behind you, Chairman. Yes, Honourable Speaker, I rise to give support to the motion as well. And just to indicate that as a nation, I find the motion very timely, the motion having been brought in November as we celebrate Youth Month in November. Youth Month is being celebrated this year under the theme, "The Jamaican Youth Are Lit." They lead, they inspire, and they transform not just Jamaica, but the world. And what better way to have the youth of Jamaica lead? What better way to have the youth of Jamaica inspire their colleagues and the next generation? What better way to have the youth of Jamaica transform Jamaica and the world than to give them the benefit of an education? Mr. Speaker, I often say that an education is the best gift that we can give to our children. And certainly my education was heavily impacted by my attendance at the Harborview Branch Library at that point in time when I had moved to Harborview whilst attending Campion College. So certainly, Mr. Speaker, the library does in fact play a positive and pivotal role in transforming, in educating, in engaging, including and enabling young Jamaicans to be the very best that they can be. When we empower our minds, Mr. Speaker, we give ourselves that opportunity to make more of an impact, not just in our lives, but in the lives of our nations. I must indicate, however, Mr. Speaker, that perhaps we look at the libraries from a different model. This is the age of technology. We are in the fourth industrial revolution, Mr. Speaker, and education is now more technical, it is now more hands-on, it is now more heavily relied on technology, and it has become more interactive. Perhaps part of the reason why libraries are not so frequently visited, Mr. Speaker, is how the library space is managed vis-a-vis how the youth of Jamaica interact with each other and how they learn. So the idea of a library some 20 years ago, when we were going to the library, for some 30 and 40 years ago, Mr. Speaker, I'm guided by the Honourable Minister who says, and for some more than 40 years, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, a library then was a very quiet space where you were sifting through an encyclopedia or reading your books, etc. However, with the advent of technology, the internet, everything is far more interactive, and young people, Mr. Speaker, when they are learning these days, I mean, they want to speak about the material that they're reading, they want to speak about what they're downloading, what they're browsing through on the internet. So perhaps the library could perhaps be, we change the model, so it's more of an interactive learning space. One of the challenges we have been having in Jamaica is that we do not have enough youth centers. The idea is to have a youth center per parish. However, we do not have youth centers in 2 or 3 parishes, again based on locations, etc. It might be useful to consider, and this was a discussion I also had with former State Minister for Youth, Minister Floyd Green. It would be useful for us to perhaps consider in remodeling libraries to look at them as temporary youth centers, or to have youth and being engaged within the space of the libraries in a more interactive way that encourages learning, sharing information, and also to inculcate good values and skills for our young persons. So certainly HM has indicated that this would be a good project for us to look at the ministry. I will certainly be having discussions with Minister Williams to see how best we can ensure that every single library is equipped with sufficient numbers of computers, Madam Minister, and also provision of internet, etc., so that we can use the libraries in a space that truly fosters the education of our youth, if it so pleases you.
Excellent.
Mr. Samira? Okay.
Mr. Speaker, I want to express sincere thanks and appreciation to all my colleagues who participated in this motion here this afternoon. It has really brought clarity to us and to the country, because I know that a number of the citizens in the rural areas and also at the parish level were getting somewhat nervous. We've had some consultation in my constituency in South Manchester as relates to the closure, the impending closure. But I'm delighted to know that the Honourable Minister has set that aside and has reassured us that none of these libraries will be closed, and in addition to that, some funds have been allocated that will go towards enhancing the libraries. I'm also happy to hear the Honourable Minister of Science and Technology speaking to her commitment to making available the technological devices so we can have them at our libraries too. And that will certainly enhance the use of the libraries, and I believe that our communities will be better off for having these libraries remaining open. So I thank my colleagues again for their robust participation, and I will now refer the motion to the Human and Resource Committee, Social Committee. I thank you.
Thank you. You have to put the motion. Did you put the motion?
Is it the motion?
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the motion be approved by the House.
Those in favor of the motion? Those against? Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, the one thing I like about your management of these proceedings is that you go right to the chase. Those in favor, those opposed. Essentially, that's all that matters. Mr. Speaker, before I invite you to adjourn this Honorable House, I want to make reference to, if you would permit me, and the House would permit me, to what was stated by the Minister with responsibility for youth in the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, that this is Youth Month. And it's a collaboration between the Gordon House and the Ministry of Education, where one of the activities marking this month will be the convening of the National Youth Parliament, which is a collaborative effort between our two bodies. I'm going to plead with every member to facilitate a successful convening of that Youth Parliament by attending on Monday at 10 o'clock, November the 11th. It's very important for them, and it's very important for us, and by extension for all Jamaica, to show the level of support that we're willing to give these youngsters. It's symbolically valuable, and it will go a far way in exposing them in a manner that will affect their behavior and their attitudes going forward. And that's what we are all about. So I beg and plead with you to be here at 10 o'clock on Monday. It will not be for long, and it will be very interesting. I'm sure we'll all find it very interesting. The details are being worked out by the House, the clerk of the House and their team, and you will be apprised as to the details. Now, in addition, you will recall, Mr. Speaker, that last week I made mention of the question of the sittings of the House. The member from Central Kingston made mention of it today. The fact is, we cannot do the business of the House in the time that is afforded or that we have chosen to utilize this chamber every week. It just simply cannot work. On Fridays you have the Senate, on Mondays you have the Cabinet, so we are left with Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays. And most members find it inconvenient to come so many days of the week because they have their constituency matters to attend to as well. Now, plus other ministerial obligations. So it is going to be necessary, Mr. Speaker, for us to examine the infrastructure necessary to facilitate the convening of Parliament on one day starting at 10 o'clock. So we work for the day where we can get through some of the motions like this valuable one that was done today and other matters, legislative matters and so forth. It cannot be done within the time frame that we have afforded it. So I give ample notice to you, Mr. Speaker, that we will meet along with the members of the parliamentary team and the opposition, leader of opposition business, so that it becomes a matter that is arrived at through cooperation and full understanding on both sides. Relevant House Committee. and we discuss it fully and arrive at all the factors that would make it much better than what we have been engaged in. So with that, Mr. Speaker, as it is not intended to do any further business today, I invite you to suspend the sitting or adjourn the sitting until next week, Tuesday at 2 o'clock. We have to bring a motion to convene the Standing Orders Committee to review these matters, and in which case members from both sides will participate to arrive at the way forward. But it's very important. And simply, and also simply, we cannot really, the Senate, a member of the Senate speaks for, I believe, 30 minutes, and a member of Parliament in the House speaks for 15 minutes. Those are alignments that have to be brought together so that we operate in a similar way. I know, that's what we're going to do. Yeah. All right, Mr. Speaker.
The motion is that the House be now adjourned until next week, Tuesday, the 12th of November at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Yes, have it. The House is going to be adjourned, and ask members to stand in their place until the mayor leaves the House. This House now adjourned.
Yo, the scammer them a call people number foreign. But when you mix up with them thing there, your number can get called.